I'm Martin Green, and this is the second of my video demos showing you how to build a pop-up calendar for Microsoft Excel. These demos are designed to accompany the tutorial at my website at www.fontstuff.com, where you can find a complete tutorial which is fully illustrated with screenshots and gives you step-by-step instructions for building the calendar. In part 1 I showed you what the calendar looked like and what it could do, and in this part I'm going to start building the calendar and write some of the code that powers it. I'm going to be doing that in the Visual Basic Editor, and to get to that I'm going to go to the Developer tab in Excel and choose Visual Basic. I could also use the keyboard shortcut Alt plus F11 to get here. Now if you haven't been here before, I'll give you a quick tour around. The main part of the screen is devoted to the area where we actually write our code and design our user forms. At the left hand side there are two windows. The upper one is the Project Explorer, and that is where you're shown what's currently going on in Excel. For example, it's showing us that the personal macro workbook is open, and also an unsaved workbook called Book 1, and that's the workbook in which I'm going to create the calendar. Underneath is the Properties window, which shows you the properties of whatever happens to be currently selected in the Visual Basic Editor. Now the first thing I've got to do here is insert a user form, which will be the basis of our calendar, into the book that I'm going to be working in, which is Book 1. And to do that I'm going to right click on its name, choose Insert and User Form. Now when the user form opens, the toolbox also opens. If you don't see the toolbox, it could be that it was left switched off last time. There's the button for switching it on. Or it may be that if the toolbox disappears whilst you're working, it's because the user form has become deselected. I'll click in this window just to deselect the user form, and all you need to do is just click on the user form again to get the toolbox back. Now the first thing I want to do here with the user form is change some of its properties. It has a name, Userform 1, because the Visual Basic Editor automatically names everything, but I want to give this a more friendly name. I'm going to call it FRM for Form Calendar. I also want to change the caption, which also says Userform 1, to something a bit more relevant, so I'm going to change that to pick a date. Now at any time you can check what your user form looks like by actually running it like a macro so that it appears in Excel. And to do that you can go to the Run menu and choose Run the User Form, or you can click this Run button here, or you can just press the F5 key on your keyboard. I'm going to click the Run button, and here's the user form in Excel just as the user would see it. It has a close button, and of course there is the caption that I gave it. Now when I close the user form, because I came here from the Visual Basic Editor, that's where it'll take me back. The other thing that I want to do right now is to create a macro that will open the user form from Excel, so I can open it as the user would open it. And to do that I need a module to put my code in, and I'll do that in the same way as I created the calendar user form. I'm going to right click here, but this time Insert Module. And so here I am in this new module, which is called Module 1. I'm going to write a very simple macro that just will open the calendar user form. I'm going to call it sub open calendar. And when I do that, it creates the end subline for me, and I just need to put my code in between. And I use the name of my user form, which is FRM calendar, followed by a dot. It gives me a list of all things that I can type in this context, but I know I need to type just the word show. And that is sufficient to open the calendar. Now, whenever you write code and test it, it's always a good idea first to check your code. Now, I know this is really simple and doesn't really need checking, but it's a good idea to get into this habit. You go to the debug menu and choose compile. Now, when you do that, the Visual Basic Editor checks as best it can the code that you've written. As long as you don't see any error messages, you know that your code is pretty well going to be okay. I didn't see any error messages. If you need to check, just go back to the debug menu and you'll see that compile is now grayed out, which means there's nothing new to compile and the Visual Basic Editor is happy with your code. And the first time you do this, then what you want to do is save your workbook. And we get into the habit of debug, compile, save. Now, as this is the first time this workbook is being saved, it's taken us to the Save As dialog, and we need to create a name for our workbook. And what's really important is that if you've written any code in your workbook, you must save it not as an XLSX, which is the default, but as an XLSM, which is a macro-enabled workbook. If you don't save it as an XLSM, then Excel will discard your code. It will warn you, but you might not read the error message, which is what a lot of people fail to do. I've got also to give it a sensible name, so I'm just going to call it calendar, calendar.xlsm, and I'm going to save it. Seems I've already got one, so I'm going to replace it. Okay, so I've created my basic user form and I've also written a macro which I can run from Excel now, so I don't have to run it from the Visual Basic Editor. And the reason that I want to do that is because I want to be testing it with the same experience as the user might have. So I'll go on the Developer tab to the Macros button. There's also a Macros button on your View tab, so it doesn't matter where you get to it from. There's my Open Calendar macro. I run it, and the user form appears. No calendar on it yet, of course. The difference now is that when I close it, I don't get immediately returned to the Visual Basic Editor. I'm going to use my keyboard shortcut Alt F11 to take me there. Now, the first thing that I want to put on my user form is a button. So I'm going to choose the Command button tool here and just click on my form. Now, the purpose of this command button is going to be to close the form. You might be wondering, well, why is he going to put a command button on there to close the form if he's already got a button up here that does it? But there's a special reason which you'll see in just a moment. But first of all, I'm going to give this command button a sensible name. CMD close. I'm going to change its caption to close, although the user isn't actually going to see this button, as you'll see in a minute. And I'm also going to change the cancel property to true. And this is the key to why I'm actually creating this command button. And that's because I want the user to be able to close the form by pressing their escape key. Now, the plan is that when the user picks a date, the date will get written into a cell or cells and the form will close automatically. But if the user opens the calendar and then changes their mind, decide they didn't want it, I want to make it easy for them to close it. And most people are used to the fact that they can just hit their escape key and a dialog box will go away. And that's what's going to happen here. If you set the cancel property to true, that has the effect of pressing that button. Then any code that is attached to the button will run, and because that code is going to tell the user form to close, then it'll close the form. Well, that code doesn't exist yet, so we need to write it, which means we need to get into the code module for the user form. And a quick way to do that is just to double click on the item that you want to write code for. So I'm going to double click the close button. It's taken me into the code module for the form. Now that doesn't show over here as a separate module. You can get to it by double clicking on an item or double clicking on the form as I just did, or you can right click on the name of your user form and choose View Code. The Visual Basic Editor has created an empty event procedure for me. It's called an event procedure because in an event procedure its code is run automatically when that event happens. And this is the click event of the CMD close button. In other words, when the user clicks the button, the click event happens, and whatever code I put here will run. And the code is going to be very simple. I've tabbed in for tidiness there, and my code is unload, which says close me. Now the word me in this context refers to the user form in which this code is located. I could equally, instead of writing me, could have written FRM calendar, but I've chosen to write me because that always refers to the current object, and if I decide at some stage maybe to change the name of my calendar, I don't have to find all the instances of it that I've used and correct them, because I will always have referred to it as me. Again, now we can debug and compile and save. Now this time we don't get shown the save dialog because remember we're already in a saved workbook and it's just doing a sequential save. Let's check this out. We'll go to Excel. Quick way to do it by clicking the Excel button here. I'll go to my macros dialog and run my open calendar macro. Now I know that if I close by pressing the close button, it should close the form. Yes, my code works. What about having it close when I press the escape key? Let's get the calendar open again. So watch, my mouse pointer's over here. I'm not going to click that button. I'm going to press the escape key now. And the dialog box goes away, which is exactly what I wanted it to do. I'm going back to the Visual Basic Editor, and the next thing I'm going to do is to put the actual calendar on the form. Now, I don't want to see this close button. There's no need for the user to see it. If they want to close it using their mouse, they can use this button up here. So I'll just want to move this a little bit over to the left so that I can ensure that it will be hidden by the calendar itself, which when I put it on the form will go on top. Now I've got the month view control, which will be my calendar itself, here on my toolbox, but you've probably not yet got that on your toolbox. If you haven't got it there, you need to ask for it. Simply right click on the toolbox, go to Additional Controls, and scroll down the list until you find Microsoft Month View Control. You'll see mine is already selected because I've used it before. The number that you'll see here might be different depending upon which version of Excel you're using it, but simply put a cross in the box and click OK, and the Month View Control will appear on your toolbox. Now in order to use it, as before, click on the button and click somewhere on the form. So there's my calendar. I'm going to move it over here for a moment. Now, a calendar control has got lots of different properties. For example, you can show multiple months arranged in rows or columns. You can format it in different ways, choose a different font and color scheme. The only thing that I want to change is this sort of 3D effect that you can see. I prefer mine to be flat, and I'm going to change it here on the appearance property. Change it from 3D to flat. It's already got a name, month view 1. I'm not going to change that, but I'm going to move it up into the upper left corner of the user form, and then I'm going to resize the user form so that it fits the calendar control. I'm going to click on the user form so that the user form itself is selected, and use its resizing handles, these white rectangles on the side, just to, as best I can, match the size of the user form itself, nudge that in a bit, to the actual calendar, because there's nothing else going to go on the form. Okay, I'm going to check it out by running it from here, and there it is, and I can press my escape key and it'll go away. Now, the way that the user actually gets a date onto their worksheet is by choosing one of these day numbers here. They can choose to change the month or the year, but it's only when they choose the day number that the user form will close. But that, again, that won't happen automatically. I need to write the code to tell it to do that. So I'm going to double click on the calendar. And again, the Visual Basic Editor has created an event procedure for me. It's the date click event, in other words, when the user clicks on a date, of the month view 1 control. Now, I've got some choices here. And the first way that I'm going to do it is to have the calendar just insert the date into a single cell. In other words, the active cell of the current selection. The first line of code that I'm going to write is an error handler. On error, resume next. And also notice that I tend to type in lowercase when I'm writing code, and that's because when I move out of the line that I've just typed, as necessary, the code will jump into uppercase, and that's a quick visual cue to me that I haven't made a typo. Now, the purpose of that error handler is to tell Excel to ignore any code statement that it can't run. If I didn't do that, the macro would actually go into error, and I don't want that to happen. Now, I don't need to write a more complex error handler because it's quite safe for me to tell it just to ignore any errors. But it's not always safe to do that, and you should always use error handlers like this with caution, and probably write a more specific error handler, but this will do for what we're doing at the moment. What error could happen? Well, suppose a particular cell that we want to write the date in has been protected. You can't tell that a cell is protected until you actually try to type in it, and then in Excel you get a warning message telling you that it's a protected cell. But what if you try to write into a cell using code? Excel doesn't bother to display the same error message as it would show the user. Instead, the code crashes, and that's not what you want to happen. We want to avoid that happening at all costs, so this simple error handler will deal with that. It will ignore the message to write into the cell if that cell is protected. So how do we tell it to write into the cell? We're referring to the active cell, so active cell dot value equals me. Again, I'm using the term me to refer to the current user form, dot monthview1 dot value. So when the user chooses a date, the month view control is given the value that is that date, and we're just transferring that value into the active cell. And finally, we want the user form to close, so again it's unload me. Debug, compile and save. Back into Excel. Now I've got a single cell selected, so let's call up that macro and we'll choose a date, and it's written the date into the cell. What if we choose more than one cell? What happens? We choose a date. I'll choose a different date. It's only written it into the active cell. When you have more than one cell selected, one cell is always the active cell, and because we've only told it to write the date into the active cell, that's what it's done. I'm going to assume that when more than one cell is selected, the user wants the date written into all the selected cells. So I need to modify the code a little bit. So I'm going to take myself back into the Visual Basic Editor. I'm going to go back into the code, and I'm going to change this so it writes into all the selected cells. Now, in order to do that, I don't need this particular line of code because I'm going to change that. So I'm just going to select that and delete it, making a space here to write my code. Now what I'm going to tell it to do is to visit each cell in the selection. And when it's doing that, the cell that it happens to be on at a time, I'm going to represent using a thing called a variable, which is just a little bit like a label for something, and I'm going to declare that variable. In other words, warn Excel that I'm using this particular word to represent a cell. And I'm actually going to use the word cell as object. So that has just told Excel that when I use the word cell in my code, this is just referring to something which is an object. Now I'm going to create a loop for each cell in selection.cells. In other words, within the cells that are in the selection, do this to each one. Cell, now not active cell, because active cell would still refer to that one active cell in the selection. Cell refers to the cell that we happen to be visiting at the moment. Dot value equals typo there. Value equals me dot monthview1 dot value. If I hadn't corrected that typo, Excel would have shown me by highlighting the line in red as soon as I tried to come out of it here. Now that's all it's got to do as it visits each cell. So the last part of the loop is next cell. And all that says is go to each cell in turn, write the value of the calendar into the cell, then go to the next cell in the selection. When it gets to the end and has written its date into the last cell, the loop finishes, and at that point I want the calendar to close, so I'm just getting rid of these empty lines here. So that should do everything that I want. Debug, compile and save. And let's test it from Excel. So here we are, I've got a column of cells selected. Let's find out macros, there we are, and run. To open our calendar, let's choose a different year, for example. And it's written the date into all of those cells. Even if I have what we call a non-contiguous selection, in other words, a selection of cells that are not necessarily sitting next to each other, and I'm doing that by holding my control key down as I select the cells, call my calendar up, and if I ask to put a specific date in, it's written that date into each of those cells, and the loop has achieved that. So we're now at a point where the calendar is doing everything that we want it to do. I've got a couple more jobs that I want it to do. For example, I want to have a right-click menu because it's a little bit inconvenient for the user to have to run a macro to open the calendar. I want them to have an item on the right-click menu of a cell so that they can choose something here and the calendar will open. I also want to have a keyboard shortcut so that when they make the keyboard shortcut, the calendar will appear. I want the calendar to show the current date. So if the cell that is currently the active cell has already got a date in it, I want it to show that date. And finally, I'll be saving this workbook as an Excel add-in, which will make it easy for users to distribute the code. That'll all come in the third and last part of this tutorial. Remember that you can follow the tutorial from start to finish on my website at fontstuff.com.